The next day, the village awoke to a scene of quiet unease. The air felt heavy, as though something terrible had settled over them in the night. As the villagers went about their morning routines, whispers began to spread like wildfire. Rico, Mateo, and Jairo had never returned home. Their families, panicked, searched everywhere, but there was no trace of the boys. The villagers, having long harbored a deep-seated fear of the balete tree, began to suspect the worst. No one dared go near the tree during the night, but with 3 young men missing, they had no choice. A search party was quickly assembled, and by midday, a group of elders and brave villagers gathered their courage and headed toward the balete tree. As they approached, a cold chill swept over them, despite the glaring sun overhead. The tree stood as it always had, towering and twisted, its roots sprawling across the earth like the claws of a giant beast. But something was different this time. Something felt wrong. The wind was still, and the tree seemed to hum with a quiet, menacing energy. As the group neared the base of the tree, they saw it, deep scratches in the bark, as though someone or something had clawed at it in desperation. And then, just beyond the roots, they found the first terrible sign. Rico's shoe lying half buried in the dirt, its laces tangled in the gnarled roots. A murmur rippled through the group, and the elders exchanged anxious glances. But they pressed on, digging through the tangled roots and searching for any further signs of the boys. It didn't take long before Mateo's scarf was found, snagged on a low-hanging branch, swaying gently in the breeze. And then Jairo's jacket, torn and discarded, half hidden beneath a mound of earth near the tree's base. Fear gripped the group as they uncovered more and more belongings of the boys, each one a silent testament to the terror that must have taken place beneath the belay tree the night before. Yet, despite their search, there were no signs of the boys themselves, no bodies, no footprints, nothing but their scattered belongings. The village fell into a state of panic. Some believed that the boys had been taken by wild animals, but others whispered darker theories, that Maria's spirit had claimed them, just as it had claimed Nando years before. That evening, a council of elders was called to discuss what should be done. The village had been haunted by Maria's story for generations, but no one had ever dared to confront her spirit directly. Now, with 3 lives lost, they knew they had to act. Father Gabriel, the village priest, stepped forward. He had heard the stories of Maria and the cursed balete tree, but he had never believed them until now. The events of the previous night had shaken his faith, and he knew that something had to be done before more lives were lost. "We must cleanse the tree," Father Gabriel said solemnly, his voice echoing through the room. "Whatever curse lingers there must be lifted. We cannot allow this evil to continue." The villagers nodded in agreement, though fear was clear in their eyes. Cleansing the balete tree was no simple task. It would mean confronting the spirit of Maria, a task none of them relished. But there was no other choice. That night, as the moon rose high in the sky, the villagers gathered near the tree. Father Gabriel led the procession, carrying a large wooden cross in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. The rest of the village followed behind him, clutching candles and offering quiet prayers for protection. As they reached the base of the balete tree, the wind began to pick up once more. The air around them grew colder, and the tree itself seemed to shudder, as though it could sense what was about to happen. Father Gabriel stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He raised the cross high above his head, his voice steady as he began to recite the prayers of exorcism. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this place," he intoned, his voice strong against the rising wind. "Maria, if you are here, I beg you to find peace. Release this tree, release this village, and go into the light." But as the words left his lips, a low moaning sound echoed through the air. It began as a whisper, barely audible over the wind, but soon it grew louder, rising into a wail of pure anguish. The villagers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. The balete tree's roots began to tremble, shifting beneath the soil as though something beneath them was trying to break free. The ground shook violently, and the villagers stumbled back in terror as the tree's roots rose higher, twisting and writhing like serpents. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the base of the tree, Maria. Her white dress was tattered and covered in dirt, her long hair hanging in tangled waves around her face. Her eyes, dark and empty, glowed faintly in the moonlight as she floated towards Father Gabriel. "You cannot save them," Maria hissed, her voice sharp and venomous. "I was wronged, and I will have my vengeance." Father Gabriel took a step back, gripping the cross tightly in his hands. "You must let go of your anger, Maria," he said, his voice shaking. "This is not the way to find peace." Maria's eyes flashed with fury, and the wind howled even louder. The roots of the balete tree surged upward, wrapping around her like tendrils, binding her to the earth. But still, she fought against them, her rage unrelenting. "I will never rest," she snarled. "Not until they have all paid." With a sudden burst of energy, Maria let out a scream that pierced the night air. The villagers clutched their ears, wincing in pain as the sound reverberated through the trees. The ground shook violently, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire village would be swallowed by the earth. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. Maria's form flickered, her once tangible figure fading into a pale mist. The roots of the balete tree tightened their hold on her, dragging her back down into the soil. Her voice, filled with bitterness and sorrow, echoed one final time through the night. "This is not the end." And with that, Maria was gone. The wind died down, and the village was left in an eerie, unsettling silence. Father Gabriel stood in the clearing, his heart still racing. He lowered the cross, his hands trembling. The balete tree, though still towering and ominous, seemed quieter now, its roots once again buried deep in the earth. The villagers stared in stunned silence, unsure of what had just happened. Had Maria truly been laid to rest? Or had her spirit simply retreated, waiting for another opportunity to strike? No one could say for sure. The village never fully recovered from the events of that night. Though the boys were never found and Maria's spirit had not been seen again, the fear lingered. People avoided the balete tree, and the area around it was declared cursed. Some villagers left, unable to bear living so close to the haunted tree, while others stayed, convinced that Maria's wrath was far from over. Years passed, and the story of Maria and the balete tree faded into legend once more. But every so often, on nights when the wind howled through the village and the moon hung low in the sky, the villagers would swear they could hear her voice. A faint whisper carried on the breeze, reminding them that some spirits never rest. And beneath the twisted roots of the balete tree, Maria's anger remained, waiting patiently in the shadows for the day when she would rise again. Years passed since the night the villagers had tried to banish Maria's spirit. The village grew quieter, with most people living in silent fear. Though it was said that Maria's ghost had retreated, whispers persisted. Her soul was not yet at rest. No one dared approach the balete tree, and anyone who told the tale of Maria's tragic end always felt a chill down their spine. But things began to change when the village decided to host a grand event, the Balete Festival. The festival was created as an attempt to reclaim the land around the ancient tree, to prove that the village was no longer haunted by its dark past. It was a celebration of their history, meant to bring people together and turn the balete tree into a symbol of community resilience rather than fear. As the festival approached, the villagers worked tirelessly to prepare. Bright lanterns were hung throughout the streets, vendors set up stalls with food and crafts, and a large stage was erected near the base of the balete tree. Musicians, dancers, and performers were invited from nearby towns, and people began to travel from far and wide to attend the event. But beneath the surface of excitement, a lingering tension still remained. The elders, especially, felt uneasy. They had lived through the terror of Maria's wrath, and many believed that disturbing the land around the tree was a dangerous gamble. On the night of the festival, the air was filled with music, laughter, and the sounds of celebration. The village square was packed with people enjoying the festivities, oblivious to the ominous presence that seemed to grow stronger as the evening wore on. At first, nothing unusual happened. The performances went on without a hitch, and the villagers began to feel a sense of relief. Perhaps Maria's spirit had finally moved on, they thought. Perhaps the curse had been lifted. But as midnight approached, the wind began to change. It started as a gentle breeze, barely noticeable amid the sounds of the festival. Then, slowly, the wind grew stronger, swirling around the balete tree like a phantom. The lanterns hanging from the branches flickered, their flames dancing wildly in the air. The music stopped, and a hush fell over the crowd as people looked around, confused. Suddenly, the wind howled, tearing through the square like a storm. The trees bent under the force, and the ground trembled as if something deep beneath the earth was awakening. A loud crack echoed through the village, and all eyes turned to the balete tree. Its roots, massive and gnarled, began to shift and writhe, tearing free from the soil as though the tree itself was alive. The villagers screamed in terror, backing away from the monstrous sight before them. From the base of the tree, a figure began to rise. It was Maria. Her white dress, tattered and stained with earth, billowed in the storm-like wind. Her hair hung loose and wild, and her eyes glowed with the same unearthly fury that had driven her to madness all those years ago. Maria floated above the ground, her cold gaze sweeping over the terrified crowd. The wind roared around her, carrying with it the distant cries of the boys who had disappeared beneath the balete tree. The villagers could hear their voices, Rico, Mateo, Jairo, all crying out for help from beyond the grave. "You dare disturb me?" Maria's voice cut through the night, sharp and bitter. "You thought I had forgotten?" The crowd backed away, too terrified to speak. Father Gabriel, who had led the original attempt to banish Maria's spirit, stepped forward, clutching the cross that had failed him once before. "Maria," he called out, his voice trembling, "this must end. You must find peace. We ask for your forgiveness." "Peace?" Maria's voice echoed with a mocking laugh, her eyes narrowing on the priest. "There will be no peace for any of you. You dishonor my memory, you mock my pain, and for that you will all suffer." The wind surged again, and the ground beneath the balete tree began to crack open. Roots twisted upward, reaching out toward the villagers like serpents, pulling at the earth with a malevolent force. The air grew thick with a suffocating cold, and the once bright festival was now swallowed by darkness. Screams erupted as the villagers tried to flee, but the roots of the balete tree snaked out, blocking their path. Father Gabriel raised the cross once more, shouting prayers into the howling wind, but Maria's laughter drowned him out. "You think your faith can save you?" she hissed, her voice rising above the chaos. "It was your faith that betrayed me. Your faith condemned me to this fate." Father Gabriel stumbled back, powerless in the face of her fury. The crowd scattered in all directions, desperate to escape, but Maria's power seemed to grow with every passing moment. And then something happened that no one expected. From the darkness, a young woman stepped forward. She was no more than 18, dressed in a simple white dress, her hair flowing freely in the wind. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a determination in her steps as she approached the balete tree. The villagers gasped, recognizing her immediately. Her name was Lila, the great-granddaughter of Maria. Lila had grown up hearing the stories of her great-grandmother's tragic death, but she had always felt a deep connection to Maria, a sense that there was more to the tale than the village had told. She had stayed away from the tree her entire life, heeding the warnings of the elders. But now, with the village in chaos, she knew she had no choice but to confront the spirit of her ancestor. As she approached, Maria's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, the wind stopped. "Who are you?" Maria demanded, her voice cold and distant. Lila took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I am Lila," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Your blood, your descendant." Maria stared at her, her glowing eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You carry my blood?" Maria whispered, her voice softening for the first time. "You are my family?" Lila nodded, stepping closer. She could feel the cold radiating from Maria's spirit, but she held her ground. "Yes," Lila said, "and I'm here to help you, to end this." For the first time, Maria hesitated. The fury in her eyes flickered, and the wind around them died down to a whisper. The roots of the balete tree stilled, no longer thrashing violently against the earth. "You want to help me?" Maria's voice was quiet now, filled with a deep sadness. "After all I have done?" Lila nodded again. "I understand your pain," she said, her voice gentle. "But this is not the way. Let me help you find peace. Let our family heal together." Maria's form began to waver, her once rigid figure softening. The cold that surrounded her seemed to lift, and for a moment she looked less like a vengeful spirit and more like the woman she once was. "Peace," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. Can there be peace for me? Lila stepped closer, reaching out her hand. Yes, she said, but only if you let go. Maria's eyes filled with tears, and as she reached out to take Lila's hand, the balete tree behind her began to tremble. The roots that had once held her bound to the earth slowly withdrew, sinking back into the soil. The cracks in the ground sealed themselves, and the wind that had howled through the village grew calm. With one final, soft sigh, Maria's spirit faded into the night, disappearing into the gentle breeze that swept through the trees. The villagers, who had been watching in stunned silence, slowly began to gather around Lila. Father Gabriel, his hands still trembling, lowered his cross, his heart filled with awe at what had just transpired. The balete tree stood silent once more, its roots at rest, its curse finally lifted. And as the village looked on, they knew that the spirit of Maria had finally found peace, thanks to the courage and compassion of the one who carried her blood. The balete festival was never held again, but from that day on, the tree became a symbol not of fear, but of redemption. It stood tall and strong, a reminder that even the most tormented souls could find peace if only they were given the chance.